Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Petrilli. I am going to be your moderator and, more importantly, your instigator today for this debate. And even more important than that, I am also a proud papa. Our second son, Leandro, was born 4 weeks ago. Yes, hooray. So I have special motivation to make sure that this event is lively so that I do not fall asleep at the podium. Okay, so that is one of my goals today. Appreciate you coming to join us for this very important event, sponsored both by the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and Education Next. And I'm lucky to work for both of those. It is a conspiracy. This is true. Now, I see a lot of familiar faces, people that come to our Fordham events quite a bit. So you know about Fordham. We're a national education policy think tank. We also do on-the-ground work and policy advocacy in the great state of Ohio. And a shout-out to our Ohio team who's watching from Columbus. If you don't know about Education Next, you should be ashamed of yourself. What you should know about it is that a couple years ago, Education Week found it to be the most influential journal in education. And it's coming up on its 10th anniversary, and we celebrated in part by launching a brand new website. If you haven't seen educationnext.org recently, you should go check it out. Great resources, all the archives from 10 years, but also now video, blog, podcasts, the whole shebang. All right, well, I'm really excited about today's event. This topic, school turnarounds, as you know, is in the center of the education discussion right now. It's at the heart of the race to the top. It's at the heart of what we expect to see out of the No Child Left Behind reauthorization. It's at the heart of the school improvement grants. There's a lot of money and attention focused on this issue today. And what we want to spell out for you today and really have a great debate around is whether or not all this attention to turning around failing schools makes sense. Or if we should instead do something else with the nation's low-performing schools, like shut them down and start fresh. Now, we got a fantastic panel today. I'll introduce them and then explain a little bit how it's going to work. So over here, we've got Andy Smerick, who's my colleague here at Fordham, is also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and author of the recent Education Next feature, The Turnaround Fallacy. Okay, so you have a sense of where he's coming at from this. The surprise is out now. Okay. Next to him, in the other corner, is Brian Hassel, co-director of Public Impact, and co-author with his wife of the Education Next feature, The Big U-Turn. Okay. Then we have Dr. Andres Alonso, the CEO of the Baltimore Public Schools. As we'll hear just this week, he put forward a proposal to his school board that focuses on low-performing middle schools and how to turn around those schools and in some cases close them. So very timely. We like to think that because that you did that because of this event. As a think tank, people are always asking.
Timed it perfectly.
People always say, "How do you know if a think tank's having any impact in the real world?" Well, see, we take credit for things like this. All right, well, and then finally, Emily Lawson, who is the founder and CEO of DC Prep, one of the best charter schools and charter school networks in the country, and she's going to provide the charter school perspective. Now, here's how it's going to work. We're going to start off with a debate between our pointy-headed policy wonks over here. Now, don't take that term the wrong way, because I include myself in that category also. Now, here's the challenge. Everybody that knows Andy and knows Brian knows that they are incredibly nice guys. All right, and they are also friends with one another. All right, so you see where this is going. This could be incredibly boring if they're all dancing around the issue and being too nice to each other. So I need your help. All right, when they start debating, if you hear them being overly deferential and nice, I want you to boo, okay? And if they go for the jugular, I want you to cheer, okay? This is, I think this kind of reinforcement will be very helpful, all right? So first, Andy, the charter cheerleader, Smerick, will present his view that we should skip the turnaround thing and go straight to closing schools and chartering new ones. And then Brian, the both and, not either or Hassel, will argue that, in fact, we should be doing a little of both. So we're going to have some debate and a little bit of rebuttal, and then we're going to open it up to talk about the real world, where Dr. Alonso and Emily will help to explain how this stuff actually plays out on the ground in schools with real kids, and how you think about doing this as a leader of a big urban district and as a leader of a charter network. And for Emily also, what would it take for her to get into this turnaround game as a charter person? All right, so that's the plan. We'll have plenty of time for audience participation towards the end. Let's go ahead and get started with Andy Smerick. You can cheer for him now. It's okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you?
Okay, so I'm going to try to be provocative over the next 6 minutes, I think, and 30 seconds is how long this is going to take. The turnaround debate begins at the school level. What do we do about a failing school right now? But the more important issue is that turnarounds are part of a much bigger story, much bigger process, having to do with how you manage a city's entire portfolio of schools. So I'm going to begin by arguing that closures and new starts and replications are the much better strategy for getting kids in better schools right now. But the bigger issue where I'm going to end up is this discussion about how the way you generate a high-performing system of schools is this three-step process and not turnarounds. The basic point I want to make is that this relentless turnaround effort not only lacks meaningful change for kids right now, but it actually is going to inhibit our ability to build the school system of the future that we should. So I'll get there in 4 steps. Number 1, in education over decades, turnarounds have seldom worked. So in the early years of California's API, only 1 of 400 failing secondary schools was able to make the big progress expected. An analysis of New York's SURR schools, their failing schools, found that half of the schools didn't make any progress at all, and of the half that did make progress, it wasn't nearly enough to get the kids able to pass the tests. A national study of restructuring found that fewer than 1 in 5 schools that are in restructuring are able to get out of that phase within 2 years. More recent research on 3 states found that that number, 1 in 5, is actually going to be even lower than that, might be more like 1 in 10. Despite decades of efforts of trying to fix these schools, as one report noted, surprisingly little is still known about what kinds of interventions are most likely to turn failing schools into successful ones. Maryland's 20-year state superintendent, Nancy Grasmick, recently noted, very little research exists on how to bring real change to failing schools, and, quote, no one has the answer. It's like finding the cure for cancer. Now, it's not like we haven't been trying. School turnarounds and school takeovers were rampant in the 1980s and 1990s. Under corrective action, schools have tried everything from new curriculum to outside experts to reorganizing internal structures to firing staff. Underneath of restructuring under NCLB, we've tried needs assessment, staff surveys, conferences, professional development, turnaround specialists, school improvement committees, instructional trainers, on and on and on. And yet, almost all of these schools continue to fail year after year after year. But we shouldn't be surprised by that. Point number 2. Turnarounds fail in just about every industry. In the private sector, even vaunted strategies like total quality management and business process reengineering fail 2/3 of the time or more. Now, a group of researchers writing about the applicability of these lessons to the government sector wrote the following, and this might be the most important thing I say the whole time. Quote, there is a risk that politicians, government officials, and others, newly enamored of the language of failure and turnaround and inadequately informed of the empirical evidence and practical experience in the for-profit sector, will have unrealistic expectations of the transformative power of the turnaround process. Sound familiar? So, if turnarounds don't work in other places, how is it possible that other industries and sectors don't get mired in a constant low performance system-wide like urban schools have? Point 3. High-performing fields have mechanisms for dealing with their persistent low performers. A firm that continues to fail will go out of business. An unfit elected official will be voted out of office. The worst lawyers can be disbarred, and the worst doctors can lose their licenses. The process of ridding a field of its lowest performers happens constantly, and it's the way that you generate dynamism within a field. The remarkable book Creative Destruction noted that of 1,000 firms looked at in 1962, 30 years later, only 160 of them still existed, yet the industries constantly replenished themselves. This even happens in the biggest corporations in America. If you look at the list of Dow Jones companies 50 years ago, the 30 biggest in America, only 7 of them are still on the list today. Many of them don't even exist anymore. The same thing happens in our elections. Consider Massachusetts a couple weeks ago, but consider 1994 or 1946 or 2006, when elections constantly bring dynamism and churn into a system. So how do these systems enable themselves to replenish themselves after all of this loss, after all this chaos? Simple. They do 2 things. First, they start with new starts. They bring new blood into the game. These are new ideas that enable them to constantly become vibrant and make sure that these new entities reflect the field better. I mean, keep in mind that the folks who brought us the steam engine aren't the folks who brought us the airplane, that it wasn't IBM that brought us Windows, and it wasn't Microsoft that brought us the iPhone. It also wasn't Hoover who brought us the New Deal. It was FDR. Second, these fields replicate and expand their best performers, so the best can do more. Take, for instance, McDonald's. It's no longer just a hamburger stand, a loan shop in San Bernardino, or Walmart. It's no longer just a five and dime in Bentonville. So years ago, you might have stood up and said, this is crazy. There's no way to bring these three mechanisms to public education. It just can't be done. Even if it could be done, these things don't really apply because that's market stuff is just incompatible with public education. But we know better than that now. First, the charter model has shown us that schools can be closed. And now there are great superintendents like in Baltimore and in New York and Chicago that are closing failing district schools. Point two, new starts. Consider the best schools in urban America, the ones that are completely reinvigorating our sense of what's possible. KIPP Academy in Houston, Emily's DC Prep, Amistad in New Haven, Tom Torkelson, who's here, his idea schools in the Rio Grande Valley. What do they all have in common? They're new starts. They're not turnarounds. Point number three, these great schools are replicating and expanding so they can serve more and more kids. DC Prep now has 3 schools. IDEA has 12 campuses. Achievement First, where Amistad began, now has 17 campuses. KIPP, 82 campuses. Thanks to these advancements, we're on the cutting edge. We're on the cusp of building the urban school system of the future. The last thing holding us back, the last thing keeping us into the system of old, the failed system of old, is our insistence on preserving the failed schools of yesterday. So this is my final brief point. For those inclined to say, well, let's do turnarounds and new starts. More than their indisputably, unquestionably poor track record, turnarounds actually inhibit our ability to develop this new school system of the future because they devour our limited resources, they divert our attention, and they clog up a system that needs energy and vitality. If we want a system of schools that is dynamic, high-performing, self-improving, and best of all, constantly responsive to the changing needs of kids, we need to give up. Stop trying to fix the failed schools of yesterday and just follow a simple 4-step process. Close failing schools, open up a wide variety of new schools, replicate and expand America's best schools, repeat. Thank you.
Andy, that was a fine set of remarks. Unfortunately, completely wrong. Now, if we're talking about our failing schools, we're talking about the bottom 5%. We're talking about 2.5 million kids by some estimates. We have a moral imperative as a country to change the fortunes of these kids, either by fixing the schools they're in, or by starting new schools that are better. And there are 2 big threats to our living up to this moral imperative. Okay, one of those threats is the incrementalists, the people who argue that the same old warmed-over school improvement efforts that Andy described are going to work. We've been trying these things for years in schools, new programs, new coaching models, long written plans about school improvement, and of course more funding, and these haven't worked. We should know by now in K-12 and also looking at other sectors that these incremental, lukewarm strategies can't be effective, and yet many people still advocate for them, and they're the default strategy in education because they're the easiest and they're the least controversial things to do. That's the first threat we have to meeting the moral imperative. The second threat we have, as I'm sure you can already imagine what I'm going to say, is this guy, Andy Samaritan. And he's a threat because he's urging the nation to put all of our eggs in one basket, and it's not a big enough or a solid enough basket to do the job, to hold all the eggs that we have, and the eggs are so important. Now, don't get me wrong. My organization, Public Impact, we've long been advocates of using new schools as a way to replace failing schools. We wrote a working paper in 2003 advocating for this approach. We think there needs to be a national strategy to do this at a much larger scale than we're doing it now. But do the numbers, people. 5,000 failing schools in the country. Charter schools, typically about half the size of regular schools. We need 10,000 of them to replace all the failing schools. We've had charter schools for 17 years. We have 5,000 of them approximately right now after 17 years. And that's all the charter schools, folks. That's all the charter schools that don't serve the kinds of kids we're talking about in these failing schools. And that's all the charter schools that do serve them and do a crappy job of serving them. I'd estimate probably 250 or 300 of the charter schools in the country are as good as the ones that Emily runs. And that means that if we keep up the same pace, folks, it's going to take 650 years to replace the 10,000 failing schools with new schools. Now, I think we can grow faster. I think we can grow 10 times faster or 20 times faster if we have the right support. but still we're looking at decades. And so we need a portfolio of strategies if we're going to be serious about this that includes not just new schools, but also classic turnarounds. Now, it'd be one thing if Andy was right and the turnarounds don't work. But Andy, of course, is wrong. If you look at other sectors, nonprofit, for-profit, and even other government sectors, turnaround attempts and turnarounds are the default routine approach to failure, not closure. Now, it's not that closure doesn't happen. It's not that it's not a key mechanism in these other sectors. But when an organization is failing or when a unit of an organization is failing, what leaders do is try to fix that unit if there's a market for the service and product, which obviously in education there is. And they often succeed. Now, when I say often, I'll go with Andy's number. I'll go with 1/3. I think it's probably perhaps even lower, but let's go with 1/3. And I'm going to come back to why that is often and why that's enough of a success rate for us to like and be happy with. Now, the other good thing about the turnarounds is that they've been pretty well documented. We don't have gold standard random trials research, as Andy mentioned, that shows this or that a turnaround strategy works the best. But what we do have is a large pile of case studies of successful turnarounds, and they show that there's more or less a formula for turnaround success, and it has two parts. One part is giving the turnaround leader the conditions they need to be successful, which means hiring a great person in the first place to run the turnaround, giving them what we call the big yes, which is authority and the political cover to do what's right, and then holding them strictly accountable to rapid improvement on a short timeline, not letting things languish like we tend to do in public education. So that's the first part of the formula, the conditions. The second part is what the leaders do at this organization level to turn the school around. And these are the actions that are detailed in that article that Mike mentioned that Emily Hassel and I wrote, The Big U-Turn. Leaders in these organizations do this recurring set of actions that involves setting a few high-priority goals rather than trying to fix everything at once, getting early wins that build the momentum for change, breaking organizational norms and even rules to do what's necessary, engaging in limited staff replacement, usually not wholesale, and using open-air data constantly to focus the organization on what they need to do to improve and create the right culture for success. Now, even with that formula, as Andy said, success isn't guaranteed. Success happens maybe 30% of the time by some estimates in major change efforts in the private sector. And let me say, though, that this is similar to the success rates in the new startup sector and the charter sector. Andy does not provide any evidence in all of his articles and in the presentation he just made that startups are more likely to succeed than turnarounds, than real turnarounds, let me say. Because he simply doesn't have any evidence of that because it's simply not the case. Now, this sounds discouraging. We're only going to succeed a third of the time, but in fact, that can be a successful basis for turning around all the failing schools in the country if we commit to rapidly retrying when our initial efforts don't work. If we do turnarounds and new starts and then just let them run out for 5 or 10 years, even if they're not working, sure, we're never going to make it as a nation. But if we commit to tracking results, tracking leading indicators, and then trying again, either through another turnaround or through closure and restart of a new organization, we can achieve success rates of 70, 80, or even higher % over time by trying again. Now, it has to be dramatic change. It can't be incremental, but if we do dramatic change plus new starts, we can meet this moral imperative that we have. If we don't, we're going to fall way short like we always have. Thanks.
Okay, a little blood has been drawn. That's good. Now, keep in mind, folks in the back, we've got a couple seats here, and so make yourself comfortable. All right, we have a brief time for some rebuttals, and then we're going to go to the real world with Dr. Alonso and Emily. All right, so Andy, you have a 2-minute rebuttal.
Sure, and I probably won't take all that time. These are unhinged ideas, really, just in response to what Brian said. First,
Andy, it would be more effective if you called Brian unhinged than yourself. I don't think you get how this is supposed to work. But
okay, so this idea that 1/3 of turnarounds work, that is 1/3 of turnaround in the private sector. I don't know of anyone, and I don't think Brian would say either, that 1/3 of turnarounds in education have worked. One of the studies that I referred to, Center for Education Policy, found that in Maryland and California, for example, the amount of schools that are able to go from restructuring to not in restructuring is 12% in one case, 9% in the other. And that bar is extremely low because we're talking about AYP. So that's not going from awful to great. That's going from awful to marginally better than awful. So I wouldn't shut down schools immediately upon failure. I would shut them down after 5 years of failure or 3 years of failure. Give them the chance to succeed, but if it doesn't work, I'm sorry. You had your chance. Kids are suffering. Pull the plug. The fact, it's true, we don't have enough charter schools. Charter school grant program gets about $250 million this year. There's something called the School Improvement Grant Program this year, $3.5 billion with a B. Race to the top, $4.35 billion, including a lot of money for turnaround stuff. Imagine if we fixed state charter laws and put just a few billion of these dollars into charters and new starts instead of this failed system of turnaround schools. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
So, I mean, a critical part of this debate hinges on what we're calling turnarounds. And I think Andy is a very effective rhetorical strategist, and what he's trying to do is call all the lame, failed, weak efforts that we've tried in the past turnarounds, when in fact what I would call them is weak, lame, failed efforts that we've tried in the past. And so if we actually try turnarounds where we do creating the conditions that I'm talking about and get the leadership pipeline going that I'm talking about, maybe we won't get 33%, but we're likely to get much better success rates. Now, you might say, that's never going to happen. You might say, that's not possible within the political structure that we have in K-12 education. But you could have said exactly the same thing about the charter sector 20 years ago. If you'd come to me and said, hey, let's create this new sector of schools that are outside of union contracts, outside of district control, the money's going to follow them over from the districts to the kids, do you think that's realistic? Do you think that's politically feasible? It seems impossible, and yet it's happened in a lot of places. If we commit now to create the will to create a true turnaround effort in this country that has the conditions that's needed, we can be successful. And then finally, all this money that Andy's talking about can be used for fresh starts or turnarounds. A creative district leader or state leader can deploy that funding towards whatever portfolio makes sense. And so it's really not an either-or strategy.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Brian. Now we are going to turn to the real world. Dr. Alonso, please give us the view from Baltimore, what you are doing on the turnaround and startup fronts, and why.
Well, first let me start saying that you are both so wrong. Just joking. It's funny because I hear both of you, and you're both right. And part of what's interesting is, you're both basically essentially the same thing. It's a question of emphasis. Ultimately, you're both calling for a portfolio strategy, and the real question is what's the main thrust, and what's possible, I think, has to be part of the conversation. But anyway, getting to Baltimore, what I think is sort of missing for the discussion is the district context. Chronically failing schools exist because of chronically failing systems, and systems engineer failure. So in any discussion about what to do at the school level, if the conditions or variables or factors that have led to the ongoing chronic underperformance of schools continue to exist, then we will be tinkering in individual schools, but we will be constantly shifting our attention from some schools to other schools, or do what has been happening around NCLB, which is that there are strategies that come into place every single year, and then 3-4 years later we come back to those same schools. We keep throwing money at schools, and we don't see the growth. So for me, when I arrived in Baltimore, and I arrived in Baltimore with lessons learned from New York, where I was the deputy chancellor. In New York, we created 300 new schools. That was possible because there was a ton of money available, first of all, and because New York is so vast that the partners were there, the capacity was there. Under the surface of those 300 schools, you had an enormous amount of turnaround effort that has very seldom been looked at, because so much of the district's brand was the new schools. So very interesting. Also very interesting is the kind of makeup and compensation that we were constantly doing in order to enable the new school work to forge ahead. So in Baltimore, part of the initial set of questions was, well, what has happened in the past? What is possible in terms of what's in the district, and what's really at the core of the underachievement at the district level and at the school level. And for me, it was about understanding what the dynamics of choice were in the district, the dynamics of class and race. Why did certain people go to certain schools and not others? The relationship game, which is such a huge part of leadership decisions in districts. Who had the capacity to come on board very, very fast in order to signal something to the district. And in year number 1, we completely reoperationalized the district so that we went from a dichotomy of charters doing certain things in the traditional schools, other things to everybody sort of gets money in a very similar way. There's great flexibility at the school level. And there's an accountability frame, which will sound, will resonate with you, Brian, I think, in terms of that everybody will be held to. So the first set of decisions were about the overall system and looking at how the system works. That led to just a different conversation. The rules of the game had changed. We were also cultivating partners. The second set of decisions were about closing schools, and in year number 2, we were very aggressive closing high schools and bringing schools on board to create a kind of dynamic of replacement. You can close schools and not have other schools to offer, because then what happens is that teachers end up in the, there's a shell game in terms of what happens with teachers will happen with kids. And this year we're closing again, but we're also offering turnarounds, because there are just too many schools to turn around. And more important than that, we have now, and there's a map missing from your materials that shows you that in every single quadrant of the city, we now have traditional schools, K-8 schools, charter schools, and a brand that I've introduced in Baltimore, transformational schools. They're really charter schools that are not charter, by the way. I have one of my charter / transformational folks across the room, so he will know what I mean. That are really about making sure that every parent in the city feels that there's a set of options that they want to send their kids to within a frame that is very clearly understood to be about accountability. What I am now struggling with is the sustainability in terms of capacity and practical decisions that have to do with being fair to kids that are in schools that are being closed when the options don't encompass them. The other aspect of the challenge has to do with the most at-risk kids, the special education kids, the English language learners, which are kids that the new folks coming on board tend to shy away from, so that the traditionally failing district schools and districts end up having to continue to work on the canary on the mine. So but you're both full of incredibly good points while being completely wrong, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Alonso. In the questions, definitely want to get back to some of these logistical and operational questions, because they're really key in how you do this. Okay, Emily, we know you're pro-charter because you run charter schools. But tell us, what would it take you to get into the turnaround game, too?
Yes, well, people being so wrong really fires me up and makes me want to get out there and do something about it. No, I'm kidding. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to agree with him or not. But, yes, I think there's a lot of truth in everything that's been said. So let me just give you the perspective from the CMO, and specifically DC Prep, and have kind of 3 big points to make. First is, what would it take for us to do turnarounds? And let's just, I have one of my board members in the room, so I'm just, with the caveat that this has not been discussed at the board level, and this is not something that is on our radar screen as a place we're going to go right now, but this is just hypothetical. So let's assume that we're going to do this in Washington, because that's our focus. I would really look at 3 things. So the first huge thing is kind of constraints. People have referred to this as environment. So what are the conditions in which we're going to be able to operate the school? And what I would want would be charter-like freedoms. this is the way we're used to working. I have no confidence that we could be successful working without those freedoms. My hat goes totally off to people who can do it, but I don't know how you do it. So let me just be really clear about what I mean by that. I mean the freedom to hire whom we want, evaluate them, set the schedule, set the evaluation process, let people go if they're not working out, give them performance-based raises, performance-based pay, promote them, etc. It's a full performance-based system. So that's totally a requirement. Second would be the freedom around budget. That we would get some kind of lump sum of money based on kids, and then we would figure out the best way to spend it. Third would be total freedom about the educational model. So, what does the schedule look like? What is the length of the school year? What does the curriculum look like? Obviously, we would need to be held accountable for results. So the idea of taking the same state test, like we do as charters, totally makes sense. So the kind of back end would be the same, but how we get there would be totally up to us. So, and credit to Shirley Monastra for reminding me just on the way in, governance. I also would assume that we would have a governance model as similar to what we have now as possible. So let me explain what that means. Right now, I report to a board. It's a nonprofit board, and I got to have a lot of influence in picking who those people were. And they work together, and then we report to the charting authority, and we're held accountable for certain things that have been clearly outlined. So some crystal clear sense of accountability that's not kind of randomly changing or muddled, and that is not influenced on a daily basis by any kind of politics. So those are charter-like freedoms to me. So one, that would be really big.
That's quite a wish list.
I know. So I'm just saying. But I wanted to point out, I'm pretty sure that it was Andy's article that had some of the quotes from the other CMO leaders, including Tom, I think, saying, and a lot of the quotes I thought were about things like this. It was saying, we need these kind of things to be successful, and we know we do. So, however, given, let's say we could work out a contract with a district that gave us a lot of those things. As Dr. Alonso said, he said charters that are not charters. So I'm thinking that they have a lot of these qualities, and they definitely exist around the country. So let's say that that was the case. And the two other things we think about would be, one, kind of timing. There's this whole thing of, do we inherit all the kids at once, or do we get the freedom to start up one grade at a time, which is a startup, but to me they're both, that's kind of a gray area. They all intersect. So either we're kind of inheriting a neighborhood, a set of kids, and we're taking them on slowly, or we're getting them all at once. Clearly, it's much harder to get them all at once. Like, there's just no other way to look at it, and it's much easier to build a culture and to control your own quality when you start small. So that's why most of the charter operators do start small. So if we were to inherit them all at once, I would want to think really carefully about how we were very clear about separating that from the rest of our brand, because we would have one set of results, and then we'd have these results. And I really wouldn't want to get into a situation where all of a sudden we haven't made AYP here, and that drags down our entire charter because of this one school, which would probably happen. It would take a couple years. We'd be able to show progress, but it might not meet some absolute bars for a while. So that would be a second big consideration. And then third, and this would be my biggest consideration, would be the talent. Do I have a great principal to run that school? And not just the principal. Do I have some great other senior level educational people who can go with them, some great teachers, etc.? And that is, to me, the fundamental point in all of this, and that's what really is the constraint. So let me just put a box around that. That's kind of what it would take for us to do it. And then I'm going to make two other points. I really agree with what Brian was saying about the time it would take for CMOs to make a big contribution in this aspect of things. I think we could make some contribution, but I did my own set of math, which was not as good as yours, but I kind of said, if there are 50 great networks of charters in the country, and they can each add 5 schools a year, which I think is really aggressive, then they can add 250 schools a year, but, Arnie Duncan's talking about 1,000 schools a year to get to 5,000 schools to turn around. So we're just a fraction of the contribution, and I think my numbers are super, super aggressive. So that's 2. And then 3 really is that it all comes down to talent. And, when I think about opening a new school, or I would think about doing a turnaround, it all is about, do we have those really talented educators? And when I think about the conditions for success in a turnaround, I think, is there a really talented educator running it? And do they have enough good people in that building that they can rely on or recruit to help them? And so I feel like that's where the gap is, and what we need to think about is how to get better people into the field of education and train them pretty quickly, and that's hard to do. It takes a while. You can't just shove a lot of stuff down their throats and they're ready. They really need to understand teaching and learning at a deep level. So you're kind of looking 5 years out if you're pulling outside the industry, or you need to accelerate people within the industry. And there are programs, obviously New Leaders for New Schools and others, but it's just not nearly enough. So I really liked Brian's and Emily's idea about the pipeline of people, to prepare to lead turnarounds, because I think talent's the real issue. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Emily. A lot of great issues on the table. Let me quickly ask Andy on the numbers one. I mean, I find this argument very compelling that says, look, we just do the math. There's no way startups are going to get the job done anytime soon. I mean, how do you respond to that? What's the counter argument?
Well, a couple things that I mentioned. So if we fix policy problems and if we fix money problems, we can get there. But then
hold on. I mean, we just heard from Emily. I mean, it's probably not more than 50 great charter networks right now.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably, even with all the money in the world and carte blanche on policy, couldn't create more than 5 great schools a year.
Correct.
So, I mean, that doesn't sound like money or policy is the problem, right? It's just capacity. We only have so many people who know how to do this well.
So, my second point was going to be the issue that Dr. Alonso raised, which is, quite frankly, the system is broken. I think we all could probably agree about that. We don't have the system in place to do the types of things that I'm advocating for, or even that Brian's advocating for. That is, the old district structure, the broken system we have of delivering public education isn't set up for doing these things yet. And if we set it up to do these things, for example, if there was an organization in Baltimore, rather than running this gigantic portfolio of schools, that instead was in the business of recruiting and training great teachers, finding the best organizations out there, seeding and developing them so they could start new schools, helping them get the facilities, and on and on and on, create a new system of delivering public education to make sure it happens, then we can get there. So I think the constraints that we have are of our own making, but they can be gotten around. The second point is, the bigger point, I think, is just because we can't get there right now doesn't mean that we don't follow the right strategy. We've been down this road of trying to fix broken schools for 40 years, and it continues to fail time and time and time again. So rather than saying, well, your idea right now isn't completely feasible, let's continue to do what we've already been doing, let's try to make what I'm saying feasible.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about this schools versus system issue. I'm really glad, Dr. Alonso, that you brought this up. We're talking about failing schools, and you're saying what we really have here are failing systems, and what we need to do is fix the system. Emily's argument's a little different from a charter school perspective, which is that let's get rid of the system, right, and just have autonomous schools, report to some public body, but basically get rid of the system entirely. So I'd be curious about how all you think about this. If we were going to fix, is there a role for some large unit called a system or something that works to manage schools, or should we just give up on systems and just have 100,000 autonomous schools out there around the country? Brian, why don't you start, and we'll come over here.
I think whether you go with a new schools only vision or the combined vision of turnarounds and new starts, you need some kind of system that at the very least plays the role of this portfolio manager, where they're responsible for educating all the kids responsible for ensuring that all the kids within a jurisdiction get an excellent education. And they're responsible for finding the capacity to get that done through whatever means they can to achieve the result. And that could be new schools, it could be existing schools that are turned around or made effective through whatever means they can. But that capacity has got to be there to be responsible. And that means understanding the needs of the students. It means searching out the capacity, whether it's individuals or whether it's organizations. And it means holding the providers accountable for results and starting different or new schools or new turnaround efforts when they don't succeed so that the kids don't languish. And that kind of fundamental core set of responsibilities, I don't think there's any way to eliminate that and just say, let's have 1,000 autonomous schools.
Yeah, okay, so Dr. Alonso, what do you think the system should look like that's going to support better schools over time?
Well, I would say that we're trying to do that in Baltimore, as in, we were not forced by any external organization to all of a sudden, make every school have the conditions that you just described. I mean, every school has control over a budget, control over an educational program. We don't have control over talent because, unfortunately, in Maryland we have issues with our labor frame. But the bottom line in terms of how to change any organization is, how do you tow with time, people, and resources? So we're trying to give school leaders as much flexibility over those elements as possible. I think that, bringing it down to the ground before we move on, it's this rational idea that that there's going to be some kind of organization that is going to rationally manage 1,000 independent schools. Quite frankly, I think that's nonsense. The reality is that schools are systems of multiple systems that are highly reflective of the social structure, of dynamics in neighborhood schools that go many, many years. No one has raised colleges, the issue of colleges and education, and the horrendous job they're doing in providing people to populate those classrooms that ultimately are going to make a difference with kids. So there are many, many systems that have to be fixed. In terms of how we redefine the central office, I've been struggling for 2-3 years with some success to downscale a central office, putting the resources into the schools, provide incentives for innovation, and not give anybody an out. In that process, we've used the closing of schools as very much a strong lever, but not because we're closing schools that have been chronically underperforming, but because it's part of how we do everything else in ensuring that every child has an opportunity to go to a better school. So we have expanded schools that are working better. They're not startups, and we have encouraged charters while at the same time beginning to hold charters accountable. And I'll give you 2 examples, and I'll try to be brief here. Number one, I'm non-renewing a charter this year, as in I'm getting an extraordinary amount of pushback from the community and the charter operator because nobody wants to be held accountable. Number one, and part of what I'm hearing back is 2 years is not enough. And what I'm saying is 2 years is far more than I've gotten myself, and nobody moves ahead when while going backwards while the rest of the system is going forward. And then, as I just announced that I'm closing 5 or 6 schools, part of what I'm struggling with in terms of the conversations with community, and I work for a board, not a mayor, so I need to manage community in a different way, is that I have people from the schools that are legitimately telling me that there's a huge impact on the 7th graders, for example, and this question of whether the new school inherits the kids or whether the kids all of a sudden go someplace else. Well, if you're the parent of a 12 or 13-year-old, and the answer is now that they're going to be bused across a city where there's a crime problem, that's why we need a system, because there's no way that a system of some kind of organism with 1,000 independent schools is going to respond to the needs of those parents in the right way, because everybody's gaming for themselves. I mean, part of what is very much a part of what I do is making sure that nobody games, and everybody's gaming is unbelievable. So no one wants to take the self-contained special education kids. They tell you that they don't believe in self-contained special education kids. Well, what about the kids that by law have to be in self-contained classrooms? Then they go to the worst schools in the city. So those kinds of elements are very interesting, and I think that what's happening in Louisiana is instructive, because my prediction, and I'm sure it's happening right now, is that at some level they're struggling with this notion of externalities, as in what are the knobs that have been left off the radio when we've created this new radio, and they have to do with systemic impacts around enrollment, around movement of kids, around the hardest to reach kids, around parents that don't exercise choice even when they have it. So that requires an intelligent response to those problems that encompasses schools that feel that they're not interdependent, but they really are.
Mike, do you mind if I just add something to that? So I've spent the last year writing a book about this kind of subject, about rebuilding urban school systems. And I want everyone to leave here with the sense that the kind of things we're talking about, this isn't theoretical anymore the way it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. These new models of the way that you build the school system of the future, it's happening. So if you look in New York, the way that they, even though they have 1,400 schools, 1.1 million kids, from the ground up, they've created over 300 new schools, some charter, some not, constantly closing down schools, constantly replicating like the Achievement First and KIPP schools. So they're getting there even though they're huge. In New Orleans right now, it's no longer a unitary system. You just don't have New Orleans public schools. You have the Recovery School District. You have New Orleans public schools. You have this Algiers network. So more than half of kids in New Orleans are in non-district run schools. Here in Washington, D.C., we have DCPS, of course, but we have the charter sector, which is educating well over a third of the kids here. So you can start to see that in all of these different places, a new model is coming into place where it's not just a single unitary district that has, as I call, consolidation, owning all schools and owning all parts of a school. You have different authorizers distributing schools. You have different operators of schools. And this is completely different than anything we've ever seen before. So when I was alluding earlier that we need a system that can somehow replicate and expand and help with facilities and help with human capital, we're getting there, and we just need the right types of leaders to keep pushing and not keep doing these old things like turnarounds.
Okay, so Andy's point is, yes, we can. Is that right?
Yes,
okay.
we can.
All right. Okay, so let me pick up on something Dr. Alonso said. A couple of times, you've hinted at race, class, these issues that, some have argued, I think about Rick Hollenberg in Education Week, said, look, if all we try to do is turn around these failing schools, which also are predominantly schools that serve high concentrations of poor kids, without breaking up those concentrations of poor kids, we're not going to have much success. I mean, this is the argument that says, and it's careful, it's not saying that poor kids can't learn. It's not making that argument. It's just saying that we have a lot of evidence that when you concentrate poor kids together under the same roof, they tend to do worse than they would if they were getting to learn next to middle-class peers as well. So I'm curious, for all of you, maybe start over here but then across, I mean, isn't that part of the problem here? That part of the reason these schools are failing is because they have high concentrations of poverty, and if we don't find ways to address that issue, we're going to keep spinning our wheels.
Poor kids can learn. Great schools have been showing that for eons. We've had a research body dating back to the 70s, Dr. Edmonds, writing about all these great schools. We knew about them through No Excuses, the book, on and on again. I don't like to talk about race. I don't like to talk about class because it provides an umbrella, a shield to people who are doing a bad job of educating our kids. We know that low-income kids in the worst neighborhoods can reach amazing levels of achievement if you do the right things. So there are schools, I was just looking at data in Houston, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in every city I can look at, where more than 90% of the kids are free and reduced price eligible, and yet they're scoring amazing, off the charts.
We have 7 of them, my 90-90 schools.
Yeah.
And 31 80-80 schools.
So it absolutely can be done. It can be done everywhere. Let's not pretend that it can't be done or that these other things are inhibiting it getting done.
Yeah, and I'll add that if you look at the experience of schools that are more diverse, that have more integration of class, yes, it's true that poor kids do better on average in those schools than they do in the average high poverty school, but they don't do anywhere near well enough. The achievement gap is still humongous. And if we think, if we can just bring some middle-class kids into these failing schools, that's going to reverse the fortunes of the kids who go to school there, we're kidding ourselves. If we did that, it might make it a tiny bit easier to do some of the strategies that Andy and the superintendent are talking about. But that's not a strategy to solve the educational problems of the kids in these schools.
All right, but Brian, what if a lot of the argument is, look, a lot of this comes down to teacher quality, and we have some pretty strong evidence that it is much harder to get high-quality teachers to come into our into schools with high concentrations of poverty. Not impossible, but harder. There was a study in North Carolina where, after one of the school busing programs ended and kids started to move back to their neighborhood schools that became, in effect, blacker, where greater numbers of black kids went, the most effective teachers left those schools in greater numbers, white and black teachers. All right, so one argument is it's not about who you're sitting next to, but it's the fact that if you have a cohort of middle-class parents, white and black and Latino, engaged, proactive, you're going to attract more talent, you're going to attract more resources. That's going to help the poor kids. I mean, what's wrong with that argument?
Well, there's a couple things wrong with it. I mean, one is that it doesn't consider the whole picture. So if you look at these high poverty schools that Andy is talking about that are really successful, they attract fabulous faculties. Now, how do they do it? They don't do it by holding up the demographics of their populations, obviously. The way they do it is they create this incredibly attractive, dynamic working environment where people think they can make a great, giant difference in the lives of kids who really need it. And that apparently way more than compensates for whatever disadvantages they have. And so if all we're doing is moving demographics around, we're simply not going to be able to solve the challenge. And the other thing I just want to reiterate, Mike, is that that's a theory that you articulated, but the reality is in areas where they have integrated the schools more effectively, like in my own state, Wake County, it hasn't resulted in this kind of nirvana of the great teachers coming and working with the poor kids and bringing them up to the levels of the well-off kids. The only place we have that nirvana is in these high-performing, high-poverty schools.
Well, I have I sort of straddle the line in this conversation for the following reason. One of the things that I had to establish when I walked into Baltimore is that we will deal in actionable items, as in this question of we need to integrate these schools. Well, they're not integrated, and we're not going to force middle class white parents to come back into the inner city. Therefore, let's stop talking about it and figuring out how to scale up, those places that are showing to be working. And as I said, 31 80 schools. I'm very proud of that. There were only 7 when I got to Baltimore. So it's very much about, poor kids can learn, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, and the reason why I raised the issue of class and race is because it does matter in the context of how do we work with communities, what's possible in terms of partnerships. When I got to Baltimore, I had 23 charters when I first got to Baltimore. Most of them were concentrated in the same area of the city. Why? Because it was the area of the city that was gentrifying very, very quickly. And part of my work in the last 4 years, and part of the reason why I had to go to these transformation schools, is because I needed to force a new school creation process that distributed options throughout the rest of the city. So, like I said, everyone's gaming. So it does matter in terms of resources, et cetera, et cetera. And my friend Michelle Rhee, who I'm sure you all know here in D.C., I mean, I've heard her say that she's heard from Warren Buffett, I think, that the quickest way to fix public schools is to get rid of private schools. Because then it would not be acceptable for half the kids not to graduate. It wouldn't be acceptable. Something would happen in terms of political will, political influence, the fights around budgets. I mean, I had to challenge a governor last year in order not to lose $30 million. That wouldn't happen if the private school system in Baltimore City were somehow part of the mix in the conversation about how to fund the schools. So it's, we can't leave it outside of the discussion because we want to assert that it's that we can all do a lot better, which I think to be absolutely true.
This is off topic, though I'm writing a book on this topic, which is about some of the gentrification that is happening in some of our big urban districts. And it is interesting. It is happening in a lot of places, and that may change the politics around this. Emily, you want to get in, and then we're going to open it up in just a second to the audience.
First, you took my Warren Buffett point because I had written it down right here because
I talked to Michelle.
Well, I've heard her say that, and I think that the big function that wealthy parents provide in some of these schools is accountability. So if we can replace that function with the function of a really good school district, a good school system that actually does manage schools well, then I think that that's less important. I just wanted to say one important thing, which is there are these really successful urban schools. We like to think that we're some of them as well. But again, we totally rely on talent. And the people that we're getting in are often not the people who've been around for a long time. Sometimes they are. But often they're new people to the field who are totally motivated by making a difference for certain types of kids, right? For kids who we think, wow, they may not get this education unless I give it to them. And I know that they can get there, but I need to work really hard. But this is a person who is willing to work 60 hours a week. And most of the studies show they don't stay that long, frankly. Maybe 5 years, or maybe 3 years. And maybe 10 years, but it depends. And I can say just from personal experience, we've tried really hard to get people to stay 5 years rather than 3 years, because then once we've trained them, they know what they're doing. If they're really good, they can move into leadership. But then they're often women. It's just the demographic of the workforce. Then they get pregnant, and then they often want to go part-time, and that's fine. Then we usually keep them. We can keep them part-time. It's better than no one. But the reality is, I still go back to money. I still go back to the fact that, whenever it was that women could do something other than being a teacher, a librarian, or a nurse, women had many more opportunities in the workforce. That was when you started to see lower quality people going into education. So we're still talking about, of all the people who go into education, you have to get that top group to do this kind of work. Anyone else in education, they're not able to do it right now. Like, it's just too hard. You have to be too good a teacher to really be as precise, as data-driven, as passionate as you need to be. So that problem has to be solved before we then solve the problem of leadership, because those people grow up to be the leaders to run these great schools.
All right, so teachers are one resource that is constrained, but let's also talk about just money in general. I mean, outside the fantasy land that is Washington, D.C. and stimulus stuff, we know that states and districts are facing a terrible time fiscally. That's going to continue, I think, for several years, if not indefinitely, as the baby boomers retire. So it's not like we're going to forever have all this free money floating around to do this stuff with. Is there any evidence that startups versus turnarounds that either one of these is more efficient or productive or cost effective than the other one?
Well, I think if you break this down a little bit, I don't think there's any reason to think the ongoing costs of these different schools are going to be that different if they're effective. I mean, you've got either way, you've got these schools are adding more time onto the schedule and doing some other things that may be costly, but there's no reason to think turnarounds versus new schools are going to be that different at the kind of operational level. But then secondly, I think a big potential cost difference is what you might think of as the startup costs. So, and the big part of that is facilities. If you can turn around a failing school or open a new school within an existing school building rather than doing something in a completely separate facility, that's clearly a much more cost-effective move. And it's not just the building; it's also the desks and the copy machine. And to the extent that you're not completely replacing the staff, that's more cost-effective. And then finally, I think a big question about cost is the cost of kind of the pre-startup cost of what it would take to create the capacity to do these two different things: start great new schools at a much more rapid expansion pace and turn around failing schools, because we really haven't made the investment in either of them that we need to have the pipeline of either leaders or startup operators. And I don't know if anyone has a good cost estimate of the relative cost of those two things. They're both expensive, and I'm not sure there's any reason to think one is more expensive than the other. Andy's probably going to tell us that the turnaround's more expensive.
One of the problems we have in the turnaround research community is when I was writing the article, I found 6 different definitions of what qualifies as a turnaround. There are differences of opinion of how bad a school has to be at the front end, how good it has to be at the back end, how long it can take to get from A to B. So trying to quantify a lot of these things is extraordinarily difficult. I can't say that one is cheaper, more expensive than the other, but I want to add one thing to this. Both are very, very difficult. I'm not saying that startups, especially with disadvantaged communities and undereducated kids, is easy. It's extraordinarily difficult, but the people who do it well do it really, really well. So when I've given Secretary Duncan credit for a lot of things, I think the worst thing that he did during his tenure was go to the National Charter Schools Conference in 2009 and encourage CMOs to get into the business of turnarounds. We finally, to this day, after 40 years of effort, have these amazing organizations like KIPP and like DC Prep and Achievement First that finally have as a core competency doing the unbelievable, which is creating new schools for disadvantaged kids. A lot of us didn't think this was possible at this scale 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now we finally have them. And then the Secretary of Education encourages them to get away from their core competency into a whole new line of business that 40 years worth of people have failed in. So as we're talking about all this, and Emily talks through all of the difficulties in doing her job and doing it well, just remember, they're succeeding despite those things. Do we want to really heap more things on them for them to get over? Let's allow them to keep doing this great thing, which is educating kids from start well.
Okay. All right, we're going to get into some audience questions, so start thinking of your questions. You can raise your hand and Janie will come around. I have to say, listening to this conversation, it is sobering. We've got, tons of failing schools to fix, very little money on the horizon, and not enough teachers to staff them. But besides that, we got this all figured Okay. We also have some questions from Ohio that we'll be asking as well. But let's start in the back corner there. Now, one more rule. We had you all clap or boo depending on how kind. If a question goes on for a long-winded time, it's a statement, not a question, I want you to start booing. Okay, it's okay. I know that might seem rude, but in this context, it's okay. Incentives work, people. Tell us who you are, and please make it short and make it a question.
Jeff Schwartz with the Appalachian Regional Commission. A statement for Brian and a question for Andy. Brian, what you seem to be saying, I just want to know if it's true or not, is that whether it's a turnaround or a startup, anything done well will work well. And for Andy, you're talking so much about urban schools. That's about 35% of our students. What about the rest of them, especially the 20% in rural areas? You're completely ignoring them, and I would say that the number of schools that are failing in the rural areas is proportionately equal to the number in the urban areas. The difference is, what do you do when you only have enough human capacity for one school and there are no alternatives?
Okay, let's take that since that is our question. So Andy, what about rural schools, failing rural schools?
Yeah, I think the area of failing rural schools is, there's a gigantic delta between how serious a problem is and how much attention we give it. But I disagree that the solutions that I'm coming up with don't apply there. So we've seen this sort of in race to the top kind of applications. A lot of the 10 states, 11 now, that don't have charter school laws, they kind of say, no, starting new schools, this isn't really for us. That's an urban thing. No, not the case at all. There are plenty of states, Michigan, Colorado, Texas, which I'm going to get to in a second, that have a charter law and largely did it because of their urban communities. But smart people there have used the charter mechanism, new starts and replications and so forth, to help rural kids. How do I know that? Tom, do you mind standing up and talking a little bit about your schools in not a very urban area and replicating them and how their amazing results?
This is like in a game show. It's like a lifeline. And I didn't know this was part of the format. But,
do I get booed, though, for making a comment? I'm going to ask a question. I think at this point, honestly, about CMOs getting into the turnaround business is right on. If we went to do turnarounds, we would all be positioning ourselves to take on these Herculean tasks that Dr. Alonso is doing. And frankly, I don't think they're going to attract the top talent. Emily really hit the nail on the head. What we need to improve the quality of schools is to eliminate the bottom quartile of our teaching core. And the only way that we can do that is if we, let's say we tax Wall Street. We've had an enormous drain on public talent because false profits were taking people out of areas that truly needed the talent, education, and diverting them into so-called profitable industries that really were built upon false profits. So why don't we take the industries that are most dependent upon good schools and tax them and let those revenues fund a couple of organizations, Teach for America, the New Teacher Project, New Leaders for New Schools, so that people like Emily and I and Dr. Alonso have the access to the talent that we need to either turn around failing schools or open up new schools. Because if we don't solve the talent challenge, then we're just nibbling around the edges. And no amount of changing the structure or changing the governance is going to go over the fact that we just don't have enough great teachers and great leaders in the classrooms.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Especially like that, we were able to get into the anti-Wall Street thing at an education event. This is...
Well, Tom, do you want to just say, so he runs Ideas Public Schools, a network of 12 schools that are in the Rio Grande Valley, began in Donna, Texas, and now serve, 5,000 kids along the border and sending unprecedented numbers of them to college.
Right. America's first and third poorest counties in terms of per capita wealth are right on the border in the communities that we have our schools. So we now have a track record of getting 100% of our graduates into and having matriculated at four-year colleges and universities, with 95% of them are first-generation college attendees. And look, if people here on the East Coast think that you have a talent challenge, try moving to rural Texas on the border. That truly is a challenge. But what we're seeing is the same principles apply, Andy. When you inject some competition in the education marketplace, you either starve the talent from the failing system or you encourage the system to do a better job. And honestly, we can get the market share a lot faster in a rural community than we can in an urban area that might have hundreds of thousands of students.
The policy lesson from this is West Virginia, Alabama, if you're listening, North Dakota, South Dakota, without a charter school law, this charter mechanism can help disadvantaged kids who don't happen to live in inner cities.
Okay, Brian wants to get in on this, and we'll get another question.
I actually think the rural the rural example really shows the flaws in Andy's thinking, and so I didn't want to miss the chance to. Okay, so there's some examples of charter schools serving rural areas well. Of course there are. I'm not actually sure how rural some of the parts of the Texas where you do your great work are. I think there's some kind of decent-sized cities that you work in primarily. A lot of parts of West Virginia and Wyoming and so on are much more rural than what we're talking about here. And so I think we need to think about what are some realistic solutions for these challenges. We're not going to have the CMOs of the world that are all effective that we're talking about now going to these places. And so what sort of strategies are going to work? And the talent is going to be difficult to get. And so we need to be creative. We need to be thinking about having great leaders of schools running pods of 3 and 4 schools, because it's not going to happen at one school at a time. We need to have teachers extending their reach across many schools through using technology, because we're not going to have a great teacher quote in every classroom, as the slogan goes. And this kind of strategy is what we need to be considering. We're not going to do it with Emily going to a rural area. That's not going to happen.
Okay, we've got a question from our Ohio Watch Party in Columbus. It's for Dr. Alonso. They want you to talk about how you managed to garner community and parent buy-in when you closed these neighborhood schools. What does that look like?
Well, before we got started, I was talking to Andy, who's one. I think you're a neighbor, about what it now means. Now that I went out on Tuesday with this proposal, which basically closes a few schools, opens a few schools, switches things around. It means a regulation-driven process of community engagement that will be so taxing on that central office that will never go away if you have these regulations that require these things to happen. Where for the next month and a half, we're going to have meetings in every school, district-wide meetings, hearings with city council, discussions at the board level. The easiest thing in the world is not to do this, but it's a necessary thing. And I will say that the tone is too pessimistic, as in this work is exciting, and when it's done well, the kind of energy in some of these schools justifies everything, because it's not about how much it costs; it's about the return on investment. The extraordinary waste of kids not graduating. I mean, there's nothing coming back after the huge investments in the lives of these kids for years and years and years. So we have put an enormous amount of energy in creating a sense of will in the community that this needs to happen. And I can tell you that I feel very lucky, because I walked into the city at a point where I felt that the city felt, okay, this has to stop and something has to happen. And I have worked it like crazy in order to in my first year on the job, I went to 120 PTA meetings. So I kind of put money in the bank so that I can take it back next year when I'm telling you, your middle kid cannot go to this school. So enormous amount of work in terms of reaching out to community. I'm my own I have a director of communications, but I am a great communications vessel for the district, and I work like crazy. And we have put community and parent participation as a kind of fundamental lever in all of our schools. So, for example, before I approve a budget for a school, except in the case of charters where the board does that function, the principal has to share the budget with the community. And there's a school family council that includes partners and parents that has to give me feedback on the budget. So there is an enormous amount of effort in gathering data and making sure that parents feel that they're part of the game, so that when we're doing these very harsh things, it's not the first time we're having a conversation about what's happening in the schools. It's a lot of work.
Okay, let's get another question from the audience. Janie, you want to pick somebody over here? And Mickey, we'll get somebody on this side next.
Hi, I'm Lisa from the Japan America Society. I have a question on the right side of the stage. If you are to start the school right now in this current situation, you want to start it small, which grade would you pick and why?
For me? Well, right now we have one middle school and 2 elementaries, and the original one was the middle, which we thought was the most pressing need, but far easier and better long-term investment to start with elementary. So right now we start with 3-year-olds, preschool, and it's terrific. And our kids who have been with us, the results that they show are just much more dramatic than the ones that they've come in and then we've spent a lot of time, and we can get them to proficiency on standardized tests. But if our goal is really much beyond that, to have kids be great thinkers and writers, so much better to start really young.
Let me ask you about that, Emily. So now that you're starting with 3-year-olds, how many slots do you have, say, for new kindergartners every year?
Right, we probably maybe have 80 slots for preschoolers and maybe 10 to 15 for kindergartners.
And Dr. Alonso, would you worry about that being considered gaming the system in some way? That these schools are going out there, and of course it's a lot easier to take them when they're 3 and go from there. What do you think about that?
Well, look, it's
I'm trying to draw some blood on this side of the table now. Come on.
You creamer. No wonder you're here.
You're supposed to be recruiting her to Baltimore, Dr.
I already did. I already said, come on. See, oh, by the way, the real reason why I'm here is that you need to come to Baltimore. And if it's about starting a new school, then I'm all for it. If you have, the gumption for a turnaround model, then, I'm fine. I'm fine with that as well. By the way, I give buildings. It's my big advantage over DC. I think it just takes so many things. None of them in isolation. We doubled our TFA cohort this year, for example. We've been working with new leaders for new schools. Right now, almost a quarter of our principals are new leaders for new school principals. We throw the kitchen sink on it, and it's not as in I've created 18 schools over 2 years, 3 now. So that means that 10% of our schools, just during my tenure, are new schools. And I've also created charters that I'm not counting, and I've closed schools. That still leaves 180 other schools that in a political environment where a board is telling me, why aren't you putting resources? Because there's a misimpression that if we're doing these things, then we're not concentrating on teaching and learning. It's about throwing the kitchen sink at it. It is true that it is about talent. There's no question that it is about talent, and that the earlier you start with kids, the higher the likelihood that you're going to succeed with them. You're still going to have to deliver those kids at some point to another school. So it has to be, a process of intelligent change. It's about implementation. It's not about theory in that sense. And it is about thoughtfully changing an ecology of schools over time, so that every parent has the option to send their kids to a school that is going to give them a good shot at whatever comes next. And then my obligation is to make sure that that's happening at every level of the system. And it takes time as well, but you can't ignore any single element of it, or otherwise somebody's going to get you for not doing it, because it's a political process. And we've been very lucky, and I'm very good at what I do. But it's not about me. It's about how all these elements are aligning, and I'm getting the room to do certain things that 10 years ago, and Andy was referring to this, might not have been possible.
Yep, let me ask you this. So I want to pick up on, you kind of joke that, people say that we're not doing teaching and learning. We've heard a lot today about how it's all about talent. So we've been talking about structure, we've been talking about talent. Let's say I were Diane Ravitch, right? I would say, hold on, this is crazy. I mean, we're doing all these extraordinary measures, but we're not doing the one thing that's right in front of us, which is to have a really strong curriculum in all of our schools. So why aren't we, why aren't we trying that while we're doing all these other extraordinary things too?
But who says that we're not? As in, part of what is interesting in these conversations are the dichotomies. You mentioned before that one of the things that you require is freedom over the teaching and learning aspects of the work. You want your own curriculum. I think that there's a mistake in equating a focus on teaching and learning with managed instruction. As in, if everybody's not doing the same thing and you don't have a kind of inspectorate system over teaching and learning, somehow you're ignoring teaching and learning. The bottom line is smart teachers. And at some level, what I'm asking of my folks, within a frame where everybody has guidance, so, there's a curriculum, there are materials that we approve, there, the tests are the state tests, and everybody knows what gets tested. So, people ignore it at their peril, right? The testing environment has shifted the conversation, or should have shifted the conversation about curriculum a very long time ago, because everybody's sort of aligning in a way that is standardizing, which is not necessarily a good thing. But the bottom line is, are we creating the systems in the schools so that teachers are wrestling with questions of practice in a way that's going to make them smarter? And are we providing the supports so that that happens? So often the conversation is, well, you haven't touched curriculum. Of course curriculum is being touched, but structures, and it's generally generate a lot of heat. With an impression that it's not being, that the teaching and learning is not being somehow thought. I have 10 days of professional development for my teachers, including today and tomorrow. So, if I'm spending 10 days worth of labor costs on professional development, how is that not a huge investing on teaching and learning? These people are not meeting in order to discuss how to create new schools. They're meeting to worry about, how are you going to reach the fourth graders who are 2 years behind? So that's teaching and learning.
Hey, Mike, can I add? I'm sorry. Let's get. I want to get another question in here, and then we'll loop you back in. All right. So, and how about in the front row here? Mickey's going to come get you. I'm glad no questioner has been booed down yet. So this is good.
My name is Brandy Shelton. I am a clinical director of mental health services for a charter school in the district. We have 3 campuses. I agree with Dr. Alonso that dysfunctional systems are why many of the schools are dysfunctional. And I also agree with you, Ms. Lawson, that it's about the talent. I'm curious as to what you all think about whether or not poor children having access to mental health services plays a role in why they're failing. Within the 3 schools that I work for, I have...
That's it. Can we keep it? That's a good question. Why don't we stop right there? Okay. Emily, you want to start with that one?
It's a really interesting question. I don't have any research or anything to back it up, so just from anecdotal experience. One thing I have noticed when I have interacted with our kids and our parents in our population, that I feel like we definitely have a number of families with undiagnosed mental health issues. And when I compare them to people that I know that have a lot of money, who, go to therapy once a week, and they kind of take their antidepressant medication, and they have all this stuff they do so that they can kind of function at a very high level, that to me is like a whole other inequality gap out there. And I don't think that it's very much talked about or noticed. So I would agree. I think it's a big issue.
We have a mental health clinician in every school with middle grades. It was a central initiative that we started last year. It doesn't get the press. But I'm running a system with over 5,000 foster kids and 2,000 kids that are homeless, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a necessity. Sometimes these failing systems are unfortunately the system that is working best for kids, as in terms of what else is out there integrating resources to deal with many other kids. They're just not there. So we've had to put resources because we haven't seen something that the schools are telling us needs to happen. It's, again, walking a fine line, because far too often the conversation becomes not about what is it that we're not doing that we should be doing, but, what's going on with the kid. And, that's a very dangerous conversation, because it becomes, all of a sudden you walk into a school and they're explaining outcomes because of mobility, which drives me insane whenever I have that conversation. Mobility, everybody has mobility issues, so why are you being so lousy at it? So, but we've had to, in order to take away the excuses, we've had to, and part of it is because sometimes the excuses are real, so.
Okay, we've got a question right here in the center. We've got 10 minutes to go. We want to make this dynamite, and then you are rewarded with some cookies and hot chocolate. Okay.
Hi, my name is Hal Qualwasser. Over the last 6-8 months, I've been to about 45 school districts around the country that have significantly increased their performance over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. They would, in some sense, probably all sort of fall on the turnaround side because they have not, by and large, closed and gone to charter, but have rather focused on what you would call a turnaround. But I propose to you that somehow there's a compromise, it seems to me, between the two positions, and this is the question. No. See, I'm going to wreck your thing here,
I know. Well, people might start booing if you talk too much about compromise and consent.
In most of the districts, not all, but most of the districts, the only way they turned out to be successful in their turnarounds was by essentially replacing large numbers of the staff and replacing most of the principals. That very few of these have succeeded keeping the same staff in place, and that the key was the tipping point. Once they got to a tipping point, they tended to fall over. So what it seems to me is that the wisdom is somewhere in between the two of you, because if you wind up replacing large amounts of your staff, you may still be stuck with some of the same work rules that Ms. Lawson doesn't like, but you've got a new staff, and you've got the shot at a new culture, which is kind of more like you. But then that means, among other things, you desperately need a pipeline of very capable principals and very capable teachers to drive that replacement flow.
Okay, so the question is, can we, if we flood the zone with great talent, can we find this compromise here where we don't have to do startups per se, but we just get rid of the old staff and bring in the new?
Okay, so the way we set up this debate was you either do startups or you do turnarounds, and never the twain shall meet. Of course, that's not true. The truth of this is, if you think about turnarounds, fixing schools, and so forth, it's a wide spectrum of what could count. And on one end are just the awful, you call it a turnaround, but really what you do is you send in a turnaround specialist, and nothing happens. On this end is where I am. Shut it down, get new people to start a brand new school that's based on choice. What you're talking about is much further to this end, where you get rid of the staff, largely you have the same kids, and you might have these work rules in place too. So I would much rather be here than here, but I'd rather be here than here. And the reason why is if you just replace some of the staff or the principal and not do it totally, some of that culture is still there. And I think it's important to inject this part of choice, the fact that families are buying into the school. So if you have the exact same district-run school based on geography where all of the neighborhood kids have to go to that school and you're just replacing the adults, the culture is still there. If you open up options and allow families to choose more, a better dynamic arises. So just replacing the staff isn't enough for that reason. And the second one, of course, just has to do with the work rules. If you keep all of the same contracts in place, keep all of the exact same money in place, and just replace some of the adults, nothing's really going to change.
If you look at the cross-sector experience on this, leader replacement is almost always part of a successful turnaround. Staff replacement, partial staff replacement is almost always part of a turnaround, but not usually full staff replacement. Partly it's not practical in a lot of cases. Continental Airlines, when they turned around, they couldn't replace their entire staff of 40,000 people or whatever it was with a new staff to get a new culture. And staff replacement at the school level is possible at some scale, but if we're going to turn around 5% of the schools or 10% of the schools, it's probably not feasible. But it's probably not necessary, because limited staff replacement of the key people who are going to get in the way of the turnaround can make a huge difference based on the experience we have from other organizations and in the schools that have turned around.
Okay, a quick response from Emily, and then we're going to have our last question.
I just have to take the opportunity to disagree with Brian because when I read about the continental comparison, I think the difference in education is that one teacher is in a room with one class, and so one teacher can do a lot of damage. Where in a company, you're working together as a team, one person's negative impact can be mitigated. But I just think, you can write off whole grade levels of kids if you have some really bad teachers that are still hanging around after the turnaround. So I don't know that partial staff replacement works as well in education.
And just to be clear, I'm not arguing for keeping really bad teachers in these schools. Obviously, that's not what I'm advocating. But I'm saying that not every teacher in these schools is a really bad teacher.
Okay. I think we have time for our one last question right here, sir. Tell us who you are. Ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Bird, and I'm with the DC Parent Information Resource Center, DC PERC, some may be familiar with. This is a very complex problem. I have a lot to say, but I want to narrow it down. I was trying to
ask a question,
be as salient as possible. You all are talking about turnarounds or transformations. You're an effort to raise the tide and float all boats, but I think you have a flawed assumption. You're assuming that everybody has a boat, and when I refer to a boat, I'm talking about parents, and I've only heard it mentioned twice. I think you would all agree that most educational outcomes that are positive, there's a household that has education as a top priority. So what do you do in either case to restore that priority to households? Because parents need to be a part of this process as well as community members.
Okay. Why don't we go right down? Emily, you want to start? You got real life experience doing this, right?
I would say it's very important, and it is hard to do. And one of the reasons that I think education is more promising than kind of employment reform or something is that you get to work with kids rather than adults. I think changing adults is harder. So we find that we try to invest the parents in their kids' success, and we use both carrots and sticks, a lot of different things, a lot of points and happy, great things if parents do what they're supposed to do, and negative things if they don't. So, your child's not going to get to participate next because you didn't do Y. And we find different things work for different people. On average, we've definitely been able to involve a lot of people and motivate them, but it is definitely part of the work that I think you need to do in an urban community.
Well, parents are clearly key. However, how a school is engaging the parent matters. And I have schools that run the gamut from they have to have 2 back-to-school nights because they can't all fit in the same auditorium, and then schools where only 20 parents show up. And the higher the grade level, the harder it is to engage the parent. So we have to work with parents. Parents complain legitimately that these failed systems have been pushing them away for many, many years. So it's a complex piece. You heard me say several times that it's a huge thing for us, as in no budget gets approved unless a committee of parents gives me feedback on it. So they need to be in on the game. Otherwise, why would anybody be surprised that they stay away?
All right, we're going to finish with a 30-second speed round. Now, I haven't told you guys this question, so you ready for this? 5 years from now, okay, I want you to tell us your prediction. How many of these 5,000 schools will have been successfully turned around? How many great new schools will be created when we get together in 2015? Andy, you start.
So if CMOs get into the business of turnarounds, we're going to see far less great schools than if they remain in the business of great starts. I suspect that the $3.5 billion in school improvement grants is going to be largely a waste of money, that it's not going to get nearly $3.5 billion worth of results.
Give me some numbers.
I suspect that we'll probably have, how many charters do we have right now? 1.5, 1.6 million? I think in 5 years, kids, we'll probably have more than 2 million kids in charters, and we'll probably have, say, another 5 or 10 great CMOs that are kind of the lines that we're talking about, like Emily's or IDEA or KIP. I suspect that we probably might have another 200, 250, 300 great charters by then.
Okay, and not very many successfully turned around schools?
No, far less than the amount of great new schools.
Brian?
I think if we take a turnaround strategy seriously, I think we'll have 40 to 50% of the kids in these schools will be getting dramatically better outcomes through a combination of turnarounds and new school creation. It's not that they'll all be in fixed schools or they'll all be in new schools, but through a combination. But that's going to take big work and big will on both sides of this, both to create new schools and to create turnarounds. It's not going to happen if we keep doing what we're doing on either side.
But the interesting thing about this, hold on, one second, is that this money that's going down to districts, it matters how it's going to get spent. So although Brian's saying it can be used for new starts, mark my words, almost all this money is going to be used to do the same things that we've been doing turnaround-wise over the past 40 years.
Well, what are we
Finally, guys start debating. It's at the end of our program. What do you come on?
Leave them wanting more.
All right, Dr. Alonso, what's your prediction?
Well, I have no clue, to be perfectly honest.
How about in Baltimore?
And quite frankly, I don't care. As in, I wear blinders. And like I said, I'm incredibly hopeful about the work that we're doing. And you heard some of the numbers. We're creating new schools. We're shutting schools down. We have to have turnarounds because it's part of the political process. and the necessary process of keeping a momentum. So I have no clue other than what I expect of the schools is what I expect of the district as a whole. Every year we're going to be more successful in terms of the numbers of kids that are graduating, fewer kids dropping out, more kids succeeding, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, and Emily?
Rough estimate, maybe 10 to 20%, maybe 500 to 1,000 schools could be turned around or started up well, and that's on the basis of kind of how things are going in the country with pockets of good things happening, but still a lot of issues. If, however, to sound like a broken record, we really tried to invest in talent development and education, I think that number could be radically different in 7 years, 10 years, and if we do that now.
Okay. Please thank our wonderful panel for a great event. Everyone is now rewarded with cookies, hot cocoa, and coffee. And you don't need to do any more fighting. It's okay. No food fights. You can just enjoy getting together. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at the next event.